My name is Emily Rowan, and I am the Marketing Manager for Rhetorics and Handbooks. Because of the amount of participants we have on this call, you all are muted at this time, but we wanted to let you know that you can post your questions for Susan that you have through the chat panel. Simply post your chat to Macmillan Education, myself, or Molly Park. Susan will address your questions at the end of the presentation. This presentation will also be recorded and posted for later viewing and downloading. I'm glad to introduce Susan Miller-Cochran as one of our featured speakers for Comp Ed Week. Her research and teaching focus on instructional technology, ESL writing, and writing program administration. Susan is the Vice President for the Council of Writing Program Administrators, the Director of First-Year Writing and Professor of English at North Carolina State University, and she is also the author of the forthcoming text, Insider's Guide to Academic Writing.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that introduction. It's an absolute honor to present to you guys today and get to talk to you about a writing in the disciplines approach. I'm going to move over here to the slides for the presentation, and I wanted to start by asking you all a question. You'll see on your screen there's a little place where you can raise your hand to respond. I'm wondering how many of you teach in a program that has used something that you would call a writing in the disciplines approach before? Okay, so yeah, a few of you. And one of the things we'll talk about today is what I mean when I say a writing in the disciplines approach too, in case you're wondering what that means. We will talk about that too. But that gives me a sense of how new this is for most of you. As Emily said, I direct the first-year writing program at North Carolina State University, and it's a program that's been using a variation of a writing in the disciplines approach for about a decade. It was an approach that I inherited when I came to NC State in 2006. I wasn't really familiar with this approach to teaching writing before I came. I'll admit I was a little skeptical at first. I was used to using more of an argument-based and research approach to teaching writing that was common at the institution where I was before. But I've really become sold on this approach to writing because of how much students seem to get out of it and how much it helps them transfer knowledge into other contexts, and that's some of what I want to talk about today. So what I'm going to present today grows out of the work that I've been doing here at NC State, specifically with my colleagues and co-authors on the book that Emily mentioned, and my co-authors are Roy Stamper and Stacy Cochran. And my goal today is to give you some practical ideas for how you might get started in a writing in the disciplines approach that I hope draws on concepts and perhaps even assignments and activities that you already do in your own writing courses and programs to sort of help build that bridge. So maybe the best place to start is to talk about what writing in the disciplines is. A writing in the disciplines approach is based on the premise that different academic disciplines have different conventions in their writing that represent their value systems, their reasons for those conventions. And what some faculty ask me is how writing in the disciplines and writing across the curriculum are similar or different. So I wanted to address that too, because sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. Writing across the curriculum, which you may also be familiar with, is a movement, of course, that's been around in writing studies for a long time, that is concerned with the writing that students do and the writing that occurs in courses across the university. Writing across the curriculum often includes a couple of different components. Sometimes it includes or is defined as more writing to learn activities, low-stakes activities that students might do in courses across the curriculum that help them to learn content in the curriculum. But also writing across the curriculum can include an approach that we're talking about today, this writing in the disciplines approach, which is focused on introducing students to disciplinary discourses and helping them to become familiar with the writing that occurs in different disciplines. So a WIT approach introduces students to those discourses, and it borrows very heavily from genre theory to explain that conventions of writing are socially constructed. And as I said, they represent the value systems of those disciplines that students are learning about. So basically, a WIT approach introduces students to the writing of other disciplines. It can be done either by having students write in those disciplines, so actually practicing the genres that they may encounter or read in different disciplines, or it can be done by having students write about those disciplines and use some of the kinds of strategies that we often use in our writing courses already to write about the kinds of writing that they are reading in these different disciplinary areas. A writing in the disciplines approach can be a pretty big shift, especially for those of us who come from primarily humanities backgrounds and don't feel particularly familiar with the writing that occurs in other disciplines. For the faculty who teach in my program, and we are housed in an English department, and so all of the faculty who teach in my program have graduate degrees in English, primarily rhetoric and composition or creative writing or literature. So for those faculty, it might feel really uncomfortable to talk about and teach, for example, writing in the natural sciences, unless they happen to also have a background in the natural sciences. That can be a really big shift. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the reasons might be for trying a WIT approach, and then what some of the challenges are, and how these two, I think, balance each other out. You might think of the bullets that I have on this slide, if you read them across, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And for me, I guess as I was trying to decide whether I wanted to adopt and continue this approach in my program, I had to decide which side that coin fell on. Which one was face up for me. So if you look at that first line, of course, faculty can sometimes feel discomfort at teaching these new genres or teaching in an area in which they don't already feel as if they are experts. But the flip side to that is that there really is a lot of student buy-in to this approach. I can just tell you anecdotally, as a director in a program that uses this approach, I get very few complaints from students about having to take our first-year writing course once they are in the course. They realize that what they're doing in this course is very different from what they've experienced in other contexts, either high school or in other contexts that they were in before they came to NC State. And they immediately see the potential for transferability. They may not call it that, but they see that what they are learning is going to help them in the courses that they'll be taking in the future. So while it is sometimes a little difficult for faculty at first, I can often sell it to faculty as well by helping them to understand the potential for students and how well students respond to this approach in our classes. If you take a look at that second line, some of the faculty who teach in our program and in programs that use a writing in the disciplines approach can get a little frustrated with what may feel like a fairly limited focus. It's emphasized primarily on academic writing. Some faculty miss teaching other genres that they have enjoyed teaching in the past. The writing courses that I used to teach before I came to NC State often involved a lot of personal writing too. So one of the things that I often do is talk to faculty about how they can incorporate those kinds of writing and how academics incorporate those other kinds of writing into the work that they do. But the flip side of that is that it does offer very pragmatic preparation for students as they enter other courses that they're taking in the university. And on that third line, I've listed transfer. And of course, as I mentioned before, there's a huge potential for transfer into other courses, for transferring the knowledge that they're learning in the classes. But there is also a challenge of helping build the bridges for transfer for students. And as a writing program administrator, what that means for me is that I often have to help build those bridges at my university. So we're teaching a writing in the disciplines approach in our course, but it helps if I communicate what we're doing in that course to faculty across the university and learn from them what kinds of writing they're hoping students will be able to do when they come to their course, what kinds of things they're expecting students to be familiar with. So it can become a very helpful partnership as well. So if you can take that challenge and turn it into an opportunity for communication with faculty across the university, you can turn that challenge into a real benefit. And then finally, I think some faculty and WPAs feel that a writing in the disciplines approach really kind of labels the course as a service course, maybe even more so than it is already, because it's so focused on helping students understand and learn about the kinds of writing that they'll be doing in other courses. My response to that is that I actually see this approach as a really rich and meaningful way to teach students about the content of my discipline, which is rhetoric. It's an exciting way to teach them about the application of rhetorical principles, but in a context that they care about and that they buy into. They understand what the benefit will be to them in this approach, but I can use that as a way to introduce them to rhetoric and to use rhetorical principles to analyze the writing that they'll be encountering in these other disciplines. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty about how you might approach writing in the disciplines in your program or in your course. What I wanted to do today is to talk about 3 possible approaches that you might use that draw on things, as I said before, that you likely already do in your courses, things that I've seen in writing courses over many years. And it makes it an easy way to kind of make a leap into a writing in the disciplines approach, either for an entire course or program, or just by introducing it in a couple of assignments in a course. On the diagram that I have on the slide, I've listed the 3 different approaches, and I put them in a Venn diagram because they do kind of overlap. They're not mutually exclusive, and you're going to see that, I think, in the way that I describe them and the assignments that I give you as examples to these approaches. So first, we're going to talk about a genre-based approach, which I have there in the bottom right. And in a genre-based approach, you discuss the different academic genres that students might encounter in other disciplines, or the genres that are common in those disciplines. Second, we'll talk about a topical approach to writing in the disciplines. And in this approach, you might have students look at a particular issue or a topic, but look at it from different disciplinary perspectives and understand how different disciplines approach the same topic, what kinds of questions they ask, how they might engage in inquiry about that topic. And then finally, we'll talk about a more rhetorically based approach, which uses rhetorical principles to understand the rhetorical work that different kinds of writing are doing in those disciplines. And I'll specifically introduce you to a framework that we use to help students analyze academic writing that we found to be really successful. So first, let's take a look at a genre-based approach. Now, for each of these approaches, I've given you a guiding question that I hope will help you to understand what it is that we're asking students to really think about when we're engaging in this approach to writing in the disciplines. And then we'll also take a look at one example assignment, and it's just one of many possible assignments, and during the Q&A at the end, we could talk about some other possible assignments that you might use or activities that you could do in classes. But I wanted to give you at least one possibility that would illustrate what I'm talking about. So in a genre-based approach, the guiding question is, what are the common genres in a particular discipline, and what conventions do those genres share? If you're digging even deeper into this, you might ask students, where do those conventions come from? As I said earlier, what values do those conventions represent? This approach, of course, draws really heavily on genre theory and on the work in writing across the curriculum, and specifically in the diagram that you have on the right. I've drawn on the work of Mike Carter, whose essay that he wrote, it was published in 3 Cs in 2007, and it was an essay for which he won the Braddock Award. He talks about the concept of meta-genres when we're teaching students about writing in different disciplines, and advocates that we focus on these meta-genres, which are genres that cut across different disciplines, focusing on the genres that span different disciplines. And so if you focus on looking for the genres to discuss that span different disciplines and that students might encounter in different disciplinary areas because they'll be engaging in that same work in different classes, that can be of particular meaning to them. I wanted to focus on the two that are in the bottom right of the diagram, specifically just to give examples of what these meta-genres look like. So for empirical inquiry, if you wanted to introduce students to that as a meta-genre and then think of specific genres in the disciplines that do this kind of work, you might introduce them, for example, to the MRAD social science report and talk about what that looks like and what kind of work that does, or a laboratory report, the kinds of genres that academics use when they're reporting on data that they collect in their own research. On the bottom of that diagram, if you were focusing on the meta-genre of research from sources, you might have them do or analyze a couple of the genres that are pretty common in writing classes, like annotated bibliographies or reviews of literature. These are all examples of genres that do the same kind of work, but that cut across different disciplines. You see, of course, reviews of literature in every disciplinary area, although they might look slightly different depending on the discipline in which that review of literature appears. So let's take a look at an example of an assignment that you might use if you are engaging in a genre-based approach. So the example that I've chosen to show you is an annotated bibliography, and I want to give some credit for the assignment snapshot over on the right. This is taken from an assignment handout that one of my colleagues, Gwendolyn Reed, designed, and it was an assignment that we used in the first-year writing classes that Gwendolyn and I taught over the summer this year. So, of course, an annotated bibliography or a literature review would be great examples of this genre, but what I wanted to show you in this assignment snapshot is how we took the genre of the annotated bibliography and gave it more of a writing in the disciplines focus too. So of course we talked about what the genre looks like, but then we asked students, if you see in the description of the assignment there, to develop a resource of annotated sources across the disciplines on an issue of your choice, and then they had to write an introduction that guided readers on how they selected the choices. So what we were asking them to do was to choose an issue that they're interested in and then select sources to include in their annotated bibliography that reflected how different disciplines approach that particular topic. And this is going to be a nice bridge into what we're talking about next with a topical approach. You can probably see how these different approaches overlap. But as we were working on the annotated bibliography, we talked about some of the features of that particular genre and why the genre is structured in the way that it is and what kind of work it does, why we would be interested in looking at and compiling sources that are talking about a particular issue. Hold on just a second. So, and of course, in this kind of an assignment, I had mentioned earlier that a writing in the disciplines approach can include both writing in and or writing about a discipline. And in this particular approach, with the genre-based approach in this annotated bibliography assignment, the students are really doing both. They're writing in the disciplines because they're practicing a particular genre that they might encounter in other classes, but they're also writing about the disciplines by looking at how different disciplines are approaching a particular topic. So let's take a look at a topical approach. And I mentioned that annotated bibliography assignment kind of gives a nice bridge over to the topical approach. Some teachers prefer to use this kind of an approach, especially if they have taught courses before where their students were asked to choose an issue that they researched, perhaps over a period of time or even over the course of the entire semester. So in this kind of an approach in a WID course, a topical approach would address the guiding question that I have on the slide there for you. How do different disciplines approach the same subject? The challenge in a topical approach is helping students choose or find issues that cut across different disciplines. But those issues are all around us. And I've had students have a lot of success writing about a wide range of issues that come from their majors, but are actually addressed in other disciplinary areas as well. For example, over the summer, I did have a student who was writing about the use of nuclear energy as an alternative energy source. And he had a lot of success looking at that issue from different disciplinary perspectives, although he was starting from the perspective of engineering, since that's what he is doing. But by starting to look at that topic from different disciplinary perspectives, a humanities approach to adopting nuclear energy, a social sciences approach to that, he started to understand the issue that he was interested in on a much deeper level. So let's take a look at an example of an assignment that you might use in a class that would use this kind of a topical approach. The annotated bibliography, of course, would be one way to maybe start that. But this is an assignment that I also use in my first-year writing class. It follows the annotated bibliography assignment, so this is what I ask students to do with those sources once they've compiled them. Instead of asking students to argue a position or to take a position on the issue that they're researching, what I'm really asking them to do in this issue analysis assignment is to understand the debate that is surrounding an issue, to understand who the stakeholders are, and to understand how different disciplines are approaching an issue, and then what we can learn by looking at those different disciplinary perspectives and seeing what those different disciplines bring to a particular issue. So in the assignment snapshot, we've asked students to analyze an issue to help readers understand its complexity, to understand what makes it an issue, and to identify the elements or dynamics that researchers should consider or study in future work. In the sources section, we've asked them to choose sources that came from that annotated bibliography. And since we were asking them to pull sources from different disciplines, then that's an embedded part of this assignment. What I loved about this assignment anecdotally as a teacher was it got students away from the either-or sort of argumentation that I often encountered when I was instead having students move from an annotated bibliography to arguing a position, and instead have them think about what can we learn by looking at different perspectives on a particular issue. And for the assignment that I gave in my class, specifically looking at different disciplinary perspectives. If you bring the humanities and the sciences and the social sciences into conversation with each other about something like climate change or about nuclear energy or about any number of social justice issues that some of my students chose to write about, what can we learn from engaging in that conversation and understanding how that conversation is taking place, or understanding how the different disciplines are not communicating with each other and seeing where that breakdown is occurring. Finally, let's take a look at a rhetorical approach to teaching writing in the disciplines. A rhetorical or a writing in the disciplines approach can, of course, be guided by rhetorical principles. And the guiding question here for this approach is, what can we learn by rhetorically examining the writing in a particular discipline? Or maybe by rhetorically examining the writing across different disciplines and comparing them with each other. Now, of course, there are a lot of rhetorical frameworks that we already use and many of us have a lot of experience with teaching in our writing classes. For example, having students analyze a piece of writing through the lens of the rhetorical situation, or maybe having them look at a piece of writing through the lens of rhetorical appeals. And those approaches, I think, can all be helpful when applied also to disciplinary writing. But in the work that I've been doing with Roy and Stacy and working on the Insider's Guide, we've been drawing really heavily on the work of Linton, Madigan, and Johnson, who use this three-part framework of structure, language, and reference to introduce students to another rhetorical framework that they can use for analyzing disciplinary writing. That this gives them a lens through which they can look at disciplinary writing and really understand it on a rhetorical level, start to understand what's going on in the writing in different disciplines. And I wanted to just really quickly touch on what each of these terms mean in this particular framework so that it makes sense with the example assignment that I'll show you in just a minute. So when I ask students to analyze the structure of disciplinary writing, what I'm really asking them to do is to look at the format and the organization of that writing to understand what that writing, and specifically what a genre is doing in the format and the organization. So, for example, if they're looking at a laboratory report or an MRAD social science report, I might have them look at how that is structured, how the different parts of the paper do different work, how subheadings are used to guide the reader. By contrast, I might have them look at a piece of writing from the humanities, maybe a literary analysis, which is something that they're usually very familiar with, and look at how that is organized, how those essays are often thesis-driven, how subheadings are or are not used in that writing, and how the reader is guided in different ways through structure and formatting and that kind of writing. So that's what we mean when we ask students to analyze the structure of writing. If we ask them to look at the language of disciplinary writing, what we're really asking them to do is to consider things like style and word choice in disciplinary writing. So as an example, one thing that I might ask students to do in analyzing language is to take a look at the use of active and passive voice in different disciplines and how those choices are made in different disciplinary contexts and what those choices mean, what they reflect about the value systems in those communities and what the researchers are trying to accomplish in their writing. We might also look at something that always comes up early in the semester, which is the use of first person. So students often come to our first year writing classes having learned this rule that you should never use I, and we talk about where that rule comes from and why they're taught that and when is it appropriate to use first person. And we might look at examples of writing in different disciplines to understand the language choices just on that level that scholars are making in their writing. And then finally, when we look at reference or referencing conventions in disciplinary writing, we're asking them to think about citation and documentation choices that are made. And this may sound kind of boring. Documentation is not always the most exciting topic, I know, but this is actually one of the ones I get the most excited about because it is thinking about reference rhetorically from a disciplinary perspective has given me a way to talk about documentation with students in a way that is meaningful to them and that connects with the rhetorical principles that we're talking about throughout the course. So what I ask them to do is to think about how the citation style guides that they're using represent the value systems of different disciplines. Why are they organized in the way that they are? Why are the citations written in the way that they are? We might look at the writing of scholars in different disciplines to look at how often they cite other scholars and how are they doing it. Are they using a parenthetical reference that lists, 5, 6, 7 different scholars? Are they listing just one and it's the most recent scholar that has said that? Are they going back to whoever made the argument first? How are they making those kinds of citation moves in their writing, and why do they make those moves in the way that they do? So this framework gives students a way to think about disciplinary writing from a rhetorical perspective. And of course, some of those other rhetorical frameworks that we use for analysis can also be very useful, talking about purpose and audience in writing. But we found that this particular framework of structure, language, and reference gives us a really meaningful way to help introduce students to what kinds of things they should be looking at as they're analyzing the writing in different disciplines. So let's take a look at an example of what kind of an assignment you might use if you're using this sort of a rhetorical approach. I wanted to give you two different examples of rhetorical analyses that might work in a writing in the disciplines approach that's following more of a rhetorically based approach. The one that is on the left is an assignment that in my own class I use at the very beginning of the semester to introduce students to some basic rhetorical concepts. The one that's over on the right is actually my final assignment that I use in first year writing. So these two rhetorical analyses bookend my course in a sense, but they could also be tweaked and used in very different ways. So let's take a look at the one on the left first. This is a fairly basic rhetorical analysis. Analyze the rhetorical situation of a text or an artifact of your choice. In this particular assignment, I asked students to evaluate the text's rhetorical sensitivity. I was drawing on some of the work that Lisa Eady has done in her textbook with Bedford St. Martin's The Academic Writer. Now, a way that this assignment could be tweaked a little bit to be more of a would approach would be maybe instead of leaving it wide open to be a text of your choice, you might have students choose one piece of academic writing to analyze and leave the genre open. Let them discover something and then see what that does and start to uncover the structure, language, and referencing conventions that they're seeing in that writing. If you have a class of many students, 20, 25 students, and they're all looking for different kinds of genres in the disciplines, this can be a really exciting activity when they start comparing what they've learned, especially if they're looking at writing in different disciplines. They'll inductively start to uncover some of the commonalities and some of the contrasts between different disciplines as they compare these assignments and look at what it is that they found. One thing that I sometimes do when I use this approach with the kind of basic rhetorical analysis assignment is that I'll specifically ask students to look for a piece of writing by a current professor that they have. Here it would be a professor at NC State. So look for something that, your biology or your engineering or your nursing or your business or your psychology professor has written, and use that as a point of analysis. One of the things that does is it helps students to understand that these things that they're reading when we ask them to go look for peer-reviewed academic articles and databases, these things are written by real people that they see in their classes or that they take classes from. Some of my faculty in the first year writing program here will have students also follow up and do interviews with the faculty members to talk to them about their writing and ask them questions like, why did you structure it in the way that you did? How did you learn the conventions of what was expected in your field? Of course, if you have a whole army of students in a program doing that, it can be a bit taxing on the faculty at your university or college. So I want to warn you about that you may not want to have an entire program doing that. But that can be a really exciting activity for students to get to talk to their faculty members about the writing that they've done, and to start to understand, again, that this writing is done by real people, and that this is the work that many of their faculty members do. On the right-hand side, I've shared with you an assignment that I use called a comparative rhetorical analysis. And this is actually the assignment that we use as a capstone assignment for our course right now at NC State. This is a pretty complex assignment. And it could be narrowed down to focus in on one of those aspects of structure, language, and reference. So as that assignment snapshot is written, it's sort of open. Students could look at these two pieces of writing using all three of those parts of the framework if they wanted. But basically what we ask students to do is to look for two articles in two different disciplinary fields that are on the same topic, and to analyze those rhetorically to look at how they're approaching that topic and what kind of choices the authors are making and how they approach it. And there are a couple of different ways that students could do that. They can use the structure, language, reference framework for analyzing those two articles. They might look at how the argument is structured, so they might draw on rhetorical appeals to do that. They might look at more of the rhetorical situation to analyze those two. But we're trying to get them to look at in more depth 2 different articles on the same topic in 2 different disciplines. So of course, if they've done something like that annotated bibliography assignment that I showed you earlier first, then they can just take 2 of the articles that they found in that annotated bibliography and do a much more in-depth analysis of them for this assignment. Like I said, it's a kind of complex assignment. It's asking students to do a lot of different kinds of things, a lot of different work. And that's one of the reasons that we use it as a capstone assignment for our course. Using this assignment has raised some really interesting writing in the disciplines conversations with my students too, though. For example, one of the first questions they always ask is, well, what do you mean by 2 different disciplines? What could count as 2 different disciplines in this kind of a comparison? Which is a great question. Do they have to be from vastly different disciplinary domains, like the humanities and the social sciences, or could a student compare 2 articles within maybe like a psychology and a sociology perspective on the same issue? And I found that even if students are looking at things within the same disciplinary domain, they can find all sorts of interesting information by doing that rhetorical analysis and understanding how different scholars in different disciplines are approaching the same subject. But even having those kinds of conversations with students can be really eye-opening for them and a really helpful approach to writing in the disciplines and introduction for them, which of course helps them to understand the kinds of things that they encounter, again, after they leave my course. So the bottom line is that these 3 different approaches that I've talked about, I hope, draw on many things that you already do in your writing courses and composition programs, but they're things that you can build upon to really incorporate a writing in the disciplines approach into your course or into your program. And we already talk about genres, of course, in writing courses, and we do in-depth research on different topics. We talk about principles of rhetoric. But what I'm just suggesting is that we take those and tweak them a little bit to really introduce students to the concept of disciplinary writing and understanding different disciplinary genres. So this just uses a disciplinary focus to help students to prepare for new academic genres that they're going to encounter later in their academic career. And then hopefully effectively transfer what they've learned in their writing class into those other academic contexts. So I'm going to stop there. I know there are a couple of questions that have been asked already, but I would be happy to respond to questions that you have and continue the conversation in a way that's helpful to you.
Susan, the first question came from Karen, and she asked, you mentioned that you use the WIT approach in first-year writing classes. Do you offer different classes for students who have selected different majors? And what do you do about students who haven't chosen a major?
That's a great question, Karen. And different programs that use a writing in the different disciplines approach do this in different ways. So I'll start by, since your question was what we do, I'll share what we do at NC State, but I also want to share a couple of other models that I think are really interesting that we haven't tried. So we just have one first-year writing course that introduces students to writing in a variety of academic disciplines. Students don't select specific sections of first-year writing based on their major. At NC State, it would not be hard to do that because students actually apply to the university. They have to apply to specific colleges and majors. They don't apply to the university as a whole. So we could do that, but we found that so many of our students change majors after they enter, or we have a lot of students who come in and don't know what their major is, as you mentioned. But we found it to be more useful to give them kind of an overview to disciplinary writing, and then in our curriculum, they have another class that occurs either in their sophomore or junior year, but that is in their department or in their college that is specifically about writing in that particular discipline. A couple of those classes are taught in the English department too. For example, we have a few junior level classes on writing in business, writing in the sciences that some students take. But for the most part, those classes are offered in the departments and colleges where students have their majors at the sophomore or junior level. So with that said, what I've seen happen at a couple of other schools that I find really interesting is a more overt effort at this sort of vertical writing approach, which is often what it's called. So my colleagues at East Carolina University and at Appalachian State University here in North Carolina have used more of a vertical writing curriculum approach in the way that they've designed their courses and introduced writing in the disciplines into their programs. So at East Carolina, students take a first semester or a first year course that is more of a basic overview of rhetorical principles, and then in their sophomore year they take the course that is more writing in the discipline specific, but it's taught as a writing about the disciplines course, not writing in the disciplines, and it is subject matter specific. So they select the course that is about writing in the sciences or about writing in medical field or in the humanities, and then they have one option for students who have not yet selected a major that does more of an overview like our course does at NC State. So that's another way to approach that kind of curriculum.
Karen's second question has to do with the issue analysis assignment, and she asked, what kind of thesis are you expecting students to come up with for the issue analysis assignment?
That's a great question. So what I ask students, and that it is a very thesis-driven assignment, the issue analysis is. So what I ask them to do is, as they're looking at all of these different sources that they've compiled about their subject, to think about what can be learned or gained from looking at this issue from different disciplinary perspectives. So that's really what their thesis is about. So, for example, I talked about the student who was writing about nuclear energy. So what his thesis ended up being, and this was after multiple drafts and talking to me about it and conferencing about his paper in group conferences, but what he finally arrived at was he realized that when he was looking at perspectives from the sciences and from the humanities, specifically looking at nuclear energy, that in these different disciplines they were counting different kinds of things as evidence in their arguments, and so they were kind of talking past each other, and the scientific arguments were not really being heard by the humanists, and this was sort of what he was seeing as he was analyzing the debate. And so his thesis was about what we can gain if we want to move forward with advancing nuclear energy as an alternative energy source. What can we gain by looking at and understanding these different disciplinary perspectives?
I'm going to address a question. We've had several questions about Susan's book and when participants could expect to see that. And right now that is looking like October of 2015. Susan, the next question for you is, in the rhetorical approach, it seems rhetoric is being reduced to surface level features of writing, format, style, and citations. Do you find this reinforces on your campus the attitude that composition is a service course and that the only usefulness of composition studies is mechanical correctness?
That's a great question, and I think maybe I have done a disservice to talking about Linton, Madigan, and Johnson's work if it appears that it's just about surface features. But with that said, I want to make it very clear that the structure language reference framework that we use for talking about disciplinary writing is not the only way that we're talking about rhetoric in the course. And I think that's a really important thing to understand. So we're talking about rhetoric in a much more robust way in the course and helping students understand rhetorical situatedness, understanding the purpose and audience of their writing, understanding even things like how medium influences the way that, that writing is conveyed and that arguments are structured. We talk about emotional appeals and about different rhetorical appeals and how those are used in arguments. So there are other ways that we're talking about rhetoric in the course. This just gives us one lens for helping students to focus on things that are going on in disciplinary writing, besides just looking at it from maybe the perspective of purpose and audience, but focusing in on some of those things that immediately emerge as clear distinctions when they're looking at writing in the humanities or in the social sciences or in the natural sciences. And as I was trying to say with, for example, talking about referencing, we're not just asking them to look at, you know, how APA or MLA or CSE or the Chicago Manual of Style or IEEE are structured, but to understand underlying that, what motivates that? What are the values that are represented within those citation styles? Why do different citation styles exist? How do you choose which one is appropriate to a specific rhetorical situation? Why do we choose the different citation styles that we choose? So what we're hoping is that it gets students past just looking at those as surface features and understanding them on a much deeper rhetorical level.
Susan, we have 2 more questions. Are you okay if I go ahead and ask you those now?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay. Cecilia asks, this approach and the assignments sound great, but seem to assume a certain level of preparedness. How might a WIT approach look for a student population that includes a significant proportion of underprepared students?
That's a great question, Cecilia. And the student population that I work with here at NC State, in terms of their preparedness for writing, it's pretty varied. This is a public land-grant institution, but the student population looks very different in terms of its preparedness from the institution that I taught at before, which was Mesa Community College in Arizona. And so, of course, students come with varying levels of readiness to talk about these kinds of rhetorical concepts that we're discussing in a WIT approach. So let me address that in 2 ways. One suggestion is that a WIT approach, just helping students understand the different genres that they're going to encounter in the different kinds of writing that they'll see in different courses and how expectations differ from one course to another, can be really empowering for students. One approach that I used a lot with my students at the community college was just trying to help them understand what kinds of questions they should ask about writing in different courses that they were taking, instead of learning just a set of rules in my course that they assumed would transfer to every other context. So I wanted them to understand that the expectations for some things differ as you move into other courses, which can be a really powerful lesson for them. At NC State, we do have a course that precedes our first-year writing course that is called Introduction to Academic Writing. And we use directed self-placement here, so students elect to take it after they take a self-assessment. But what we've decided to do in that course is we introduce students to some of these concepts, but we don't have as heavy of a focus on writing in the disciplines in our Introduction to Academic Writing course. We're not doing as much comparison of disciplinary writing, but instead we have a pretty heavy emphasis on reading different kinds of academic writing and helping to build some familiarity with the different kinds of writing that we're going to be asking them to analyze when they get into our first-year writing course. So helping them to become familiar with reading that kind of work and how to apply a rhetorical reading approach to just the beginning pieces of that to that kind of writing can be very helpful, I think, with underprepared students.
Alex asks, have you ever had an issue wherein a student wrote on a subject with which the student has a high context relationship and you did not, making it harder for you to understand what the student was saying and dampening your ability to assess the assignment?
Yes, I have. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. I can think of a couple of good examples. So NC State has very strong programs in technology and engineering. I'm not an engineer. So sometimes my students will choose, because I really encourage them to look for topics related to the kinds of careers or disciplines that they imagine they're going to be invested in the future. Some of them have selected their majors, but not all of them are completely decided. So I've had students who have written about pretty complex concepts related to, and I gave the nuclear energy one. I don't know a whole lot about fission and fusion, and so there are things that I don't understand on a deep content level sometimes that the students are writing about. And this is why I often like the last approach that I talked about best, which is the rhetorical approach, because I can ask students to talk about and master concepts of rhetoric without having to get too much into the detail of all of the content that they're writing about. I'm not asking them to make an argument necessarily about a really complex concept in engineering, but to understand at some level how those arguments and how that writing is being structured and developed in their disciplines. But yes, sometimes that can be really challenging. I guess on the flip side, I learn a lot about a bunch of different disciplinary areas, especially by asking students to choose articles that other faculty at NC State have written. Sometimes I learn about the work that my colleagues across the university are doing, although I am, of course, not expert in that. So I think that's a great question, and certainly a concern sometimes that faculty members have as they're moving into this kind of an approach. But that's why I think sometimes the writing about the disciplines approach rather than writing in the disciplines can feel a little bit more comfortable for faculty, especially who come from a humanities background.
Those were all the questions that we had thus far, Susan. Okay, well, Susan, do you have anything else to add? I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting you off.
No, I don't think so at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for attending today and for the attention and great questions that you offered.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if I put my email into the chat feature, and if you all have questions about Susan's book or anything else, please feel free to email me, and we will get back to you on that. One last question.
Okay.
We'll take this one more from Cecilia. What kinds of rubrics are used? Do faculty share a common one? And she said maybe this is something that we might need to respond to her afterwards via email.
Yeah, that's a great question, Cecilia. And I just put my email address in there too, and I am more than happy to respond to questions that any of you might have about specifics related to some of the assignments or how they're assessed, or if I can provide other examples of assignments and rubrics. We do not use common rubrics in our program, mainly because we don't have a whole lot of common assignments. We do have that comparative rhetorical analysis, which is a common assignment for our program assessment. But we really encourage faculty to develop rubrics that are specific to the assignments that they are giving and the rhetorical situations that they've identified for their students. But with that said, we do have some common evaluative criteria that we ask faculty to consider when they are developing those rubrics. And the evaluative criteria address things like rhetorical knowledge, the development of argument or logic within the writing. And there is, of course, some attention to conventions and surface features in the writing as well, their use of sources, but that differs somewhat according to the different assignments that faculty are given. If it would be helpful to share some examples of rubrics that we have used for the assignments that I've given you the snapshots for, I'd be happy to do that. And I should also clarify, the snapshots that I've given you are really small pieces of a larger assignment that we provide for students. So if it's helpful to see the larger assignment, I'm happy to provide that as well.
We appreciate your questions and you all participating in the WebEx. We know your time is valuable. And we hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.